At first light, the Exmoor hills still slept under a blanket of silvery mist, their wild silence broken only by the distant calls of curlews and the subtle thrum of a new day. As the fog rolled over the gorse and bramble, a drone camera soared across the landscape, catching a sudden rush, a ripple in the grass, a storm of hooves. Bracken, the legendary Exmoor Stallion, thundered through the dew-soaked meadow, his mane streaked with rain and wind, muscles taut as he led his unruly band of ponies straight across the ancient land. No bridle, no saddle, no human hand had ever claimed him. He belonged only to the hills. On the far edge of the field, a crowd was gathering, breath steaming in the spring chill. All eyes turned to the stone paddock, where Lord Edward Ashford stood, ramrod straight, silver hair gleaming under his black bowler. Ninth in a line of English aristocrats, Lord of Ashford Hall, the master of all he surveyed, except for one thing. That stallion out there was his pride and his shame. He gripped the fence, knuckles white, his heart pounding as Bracken whirled at the edge of the ring. Edward had spent the entire winter vowing that this year would be different. This year the Ashford name would reclaim its place at the center of the region's grandest equestrian traditions. This year he would break Bracken's wildness for good, prove that centuries of riders' blood meant something, that his line had not faded into irrelevance. The murmurs of the villagers grew, some anxious, some skeptical, as Lord Ashford entered the ring. He moved with the crisp precision of old cavalry drills, trying to mask the limp that age had given him. The stable hands watched in nervous silence. Near the rail, Victor Harrington, slick, broad-shouldered, with a city tan and a wolf's grin, leaned in to his companions, already mocking in low tones. Harrington had been Edward's rival since Eton, and now, after decades in real estate and politics, he had returned, smelling blood in the water. His eyes never left Edward. The challenge was simple: break Bracken before the Cheltenham Horse Parade. Make him accept the bit, the saddle, the Ashford seal. But as Edward approached, Bracken snorted, ears pinned back, nostrils flaring at the strange mix of fear and defiance rising from the man before him. Edward paused, holding out a halter, using every ounce of patience his ancestors had drilled into him. The stallion took one step, then another, and then, without warning, reared up, hooves slicing the mist, eyes wide with the wild spirit of the moor itself. The crowd gasped. Edward's hand wavered. For a heartbeat, horse and man stared each other down, silent except for the thudding of Edward's own heart. Then Bracken exploded, wheeling away, kicking up dirt and clods of grass as he bolted for the far end of the paddock. Edward stumbled back, boots sliding in the mud. His hat tumbled to the ground. That was all Harrington needed. He stepped forward, arms wide, voice booming over the mutters of the onlookers. "Well now, seems the famous Ashford touch is all talk, unless you've trained your horses to be circus acrobats, Edward." Edward straightened, jaw clenched, pride burning hotter than his embarrassment. The villagers watched, hungry for drama, the old families and the new money at each other's throats. The heartbeat of the morning shifted, the tension electric, raw. "You want to put your money where your mouth is, Victor?" Edward said, his voice cutting through the chilly air. "Name your wager." Harrington grinned, the predator's smile widening. "All right then. If nobody here can get a saddle on that beast before the Ashford Forum, you sell me your precious orchard. Let's give your apples a taste of luxury real estate, finally. But if you succeed, I'll fund that charity of yours for those wild ponies you care so much about. Double the amount, in fact. What do you say?" A murmur ran through the crowd, heads turning, whispers rising. The ancient Ashford orchard, the last remnant of the estate's old glory, beloved by generations, fiercely guarded against every outsider. Edward hesitated only a moment, then nodded. "You have a deal." Cheers, gasps, and the sharp click of cell phone cameras. Some folks clapped, others shook their heads. The centuries of tradition, the land, the blood, the pride of Exmoor itself. Suddenly, it all hung on this wild, untamed stallion, and on an old man's fading strength. The mist lifted a little as Bracken circled in the distance, his coat shining bronze and black, breath curling in the crisp morning. For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, like thunder echoing across the hills, the first real drama of the season had begun. All Exmoor would be watching. Lord Ashford stood alone in the ring, breathing hard, hat forgotten at his feet, the taste of defeat bitter on his tongue. Yet somewhere, beneath the shame and the anger, something else stirred. A memory, perhaps, or a challenge older than pride itself. As the crowd began to disperse, Victor's laughter echoed, sharp and cold. Edward's gaze settled on the horizon, on the shadowy outline of Bracken standing atop the ridge. He didn't notice the small, pale girl at the far fence, watching everything with wide, unblinking eyes, her life about to entwine with his in ways neither could imagine. The stage was set. The race for honor, for legacy, for the very soul of Exmoor, had truly begun. The moving van groaned and sputtered as it pulled up the winding gravel road to Ashford Hall. The mist was just burning away, revealing the vast green stretches of the estate, hedgerows bursting with spring buds and the wild, craggy outline of Exmoor in the distance. Sophie Turner sat pressed against the window, clutching the frayed backpack that held all the pieces of her old life. A tattered book on horsemanship, a faded photograph of her parents, a single silver necklace. Her grandmother, Lady Margaret Turner, sat beside her, back straight and hands folded primly in her lap, hiding her own nerves beneath a mask of English composure. As the van rolled to a stop in front of the old caretaker's cottage, a squat stone building at the edge of the estate, Sophie's heart hammered in her chest. She didn't know how to be here, didn't know this countryside, these traditions, the ancient house that loomed behind a stand of yew trees. Everything about her life in London was gone, swept away in a single merciless night. The accident, the sirens, the endless hush of hospital corridors. Now there was only this new place, this new beginning she hadn't asked for. They unpacked in silence, Sophie trailing her fingers across the rough walls, the smell of peat and wood smoke already settling into her hair. Margaret tried to make the little house cheerful, fresh bread, tulips in a chipped vase. But the ache of loss lingered, heavy and silent. Later that afternoon, Sophie slipped out while her grandmother napped, boots crunching over the spring grass, drawn by the distant sound of hooves and the shimmer of movement at the far end of the pasture. She crept up to the ancient stone fence that bordered the wildest part of the estate. Beyond it, the land rolled toward the hills, patches of heather and bramble catching the sunlight, shadows flickering as a herd of Exmoor ponies grazed in the distance. She watched, barely breathing. The herd moved with a slow, powerful grace, manes tangled, flanks muddy, every movement a reminder of something untamed. At their center, larger and darker than the rest, stood Bracken. The stallion tossed his head, sending a shockwave through the other ponies. He was magnificent. Coal-black mane, deep brown coat that shimmered with hints of gold, eyes sharp and restless. Even from a distance, He looked like something pulled from legend. Sophie stood very still, hands gripping the cold stones, willing him to come closer. She didn't call out, didn't dare move, not wanting to spook him. For a long, breathless moment, Bracken ignored her, snorting softly, muscles rippling under his hide. Then, almost as if sensing her gaze, he turned, fixing her with those wild, intelligent eyes. His ears flicked forward. Sophie's heart skipped. She held her ground, feeling the weight of his gaze, the wildness in him calling to the hurt inside her. Time seemed to slow. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the space between girl and horse. Pain meeting pride, loneliness meeting freedom. Bracken took a cautious step toward the fence, nostrils flaring. Sophie didn't move, barely even blinked. She thought of her mother, of the bedtime stories about wild horses running free, of the gentle way her father used to hold her hand at the city stables. Something inside her ached to reach out. But before anything else could pass between them, a dog barked somewhere behind the house. Bracken jerked his head, muscles tensing. The spell was broken. He turned sharply, galloping back to his herd, dust and dew flying from his hooves. Sophie let out the breath she'd been holding, a strange mix of disappointment and awe rushing through her. She stayed at the fence long after he'd vanished, replaying the moment, unsure if it had even been real. Back inside, Margaret was making tea, humming an old tune. Sophie said nothing about Bracken, just watched the steam curl up from her cup. The cottage felt even smaller now, the silence pressing in. But Sophie carried the memory of the stallion with her, something bright and fierce that wouldn't let go. The next day, Sophie wandered the estate again, unable to resist the pull of the hills. She paused near the paddock where she'd seen the failed attempt to break Bracken. The mud still churned from the stallion's wild run. She noticed Lord Ashford standing at the far end, coat immaculate, boots polished, eyes fixed on the horizon. He looked every inch the lord of the manor, remote, unapproachable, haunted by yesterday's loss. Their eyes met briefly. He looked through her, barely seeing the small girl in borrowed boots, before turning away. Sophie felt a flicker of irritation. She didn't like being invisible, just another piece of furniture in this old world. That evening, the village of Myrecombe buzzed with gossip about the morning's spectacle. At the Copper Stag, the locals argued over pints about the wager, some rooting for Ashford out of loyalty, others whispering that maybe it was time for change. Victor Harrington's name was on everyone's lips, his promise of new jobs and tourist money already swaying a few of the younger farmers. But in the cottage on the edge of the estate, Sophie lay awake, staring at the moonlit ceiling, listening to the wind rattle the panes. She turned the old book over in her hands, complete Horsemanship, her mother's notes filling the margins in soft pencil. She traced the faded lines, reading about patience, trust, the unspoken language between horse and rider. She wondered if Bracken could ever trust anyone. She wondered if she could too. Outside on the distant hill, Bracken stood alone, watching the cottage lights flicker. The girl and the stallion, both outsiders, both carrying old wounds, had seen each other, and something had shifted. Neither could know yet how much their meeting would change everything. The first night in her new home, Sophie finally slept, dreaming of hooves thundering over wild grass, of dark eyes meeting hers, of a voice whispering that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply not turn away. It was the gold-drenched afternoons that Sophie would remember most in the years to come. The hush of Exmoor after school, the song of larks fading as the sun stretched long across the rolling hills. and the secret thrill in her chest as she tiptoed through dew-wet grass, clutching a handful of carrots swiped from her grandmother's pantry. Lady Margaret suspected nothing. She believed Sophie needed fresh air and quiet time after the chaos of London. So each evening, after the chores were done, Sophie slipped away, heart beating fast, following the worn sheep trails to the wild edge of Ashford Hall. She always brought the book, complete horsemanship, dog-eared and loved, her mother's handwriting drifting into the margins with gentle reminders. Patience, no sudden moves. They sense your fear. Sophie read the passages over and over, the words like a map guiding her into this new world. She didn't know how to be brave. Not really, but out here beneath the open sky, she tried. She would sit at the crumbling stone fence, careful not to make a sound, and watch the Exmoor ponies graze. Sometimes they were a blur in the mist, sometimes so close she could hear the snort and huff of their breath. Bracken was always at the center, a silent sentinel, mane wild and eyes sharper than the cold March wind. He never let the others wander far. The first evening, Sophie waited an hour before he even glanced in her direction. But she was stubborn, and the next night she waited again and again. Each time she left the carrots on the stone, backing away slowly, whispering thanks into the dusk. One evening, as she settled in her usual spot with her book, she felt the prickle of eyes on her. She looked up. Bracken was watching, ears flicked forward, one hoof poised mid-step. Sophie held her breath, pulse racing. She dared not move. The stallion snorted, shook his mane, and trotted a few paces closer. Sophie could almost hear her mother's voice. Soft, Sophie, let him come to you. She opened the book, reading aloud in a whisper, her words carried by the breeze. A horse is a mirror to your soul. Sometimes you need a second chance to see your own reflection. Bracken's ears twitched. He took a careful step, then another, the other ponies trailing behind him. When she finally dared look up again, the carrots were gone. From the upper windows of Ashford Hall, Lord Edward Ashford watched the scene unfold, his expression unreadable. He'd noticed the girl's visits, the way she crept through the fields like a ghost, the Exmoor stallion drawn toward her more each day. At first he was annoyed. Rules were rules, and children did not belong in the wild pastures. But something about her persistence pricked at him, something he could not quite explain. In the evenings, when the library felt colder and the eyes of his ancestors stared down from the walls, Edward found himself thinking of the girl and the stallion, two orphans, each searching for a place to belong. He brought up his concerns with Dr. Philip Collins the next afternoon, as they walked the muddy lanes toward the main stables. Collins, the village vet, had the easy confidence of a man used to both animals and stubborn landowners. He'd grown up on Exmoor, trained at the Royal Veterinary College, and now spent his days straddling the old ways and the new, teaching gentle horsemanship to anyone who would listen. You see her out there, Edward said, nodding toward the ridge where Sophie's small figure was just visible. She's always reading, always watching that damned stallion. Collins smiled, rubbing his chin. Horses don't fear the whip, Lord Ashford. Not really. They fear being alone. That's why they run in herds, why they fight so hard to protect each other. Maybe the girl understands something we don't. Edward scoffed, but the words lingered. He had spent his life trying to uphold the Ashford name, to hold together a crumbling legacy. What did he know of loneliness? Enough, perhaps, to recognize it in others. That evening, as Sophie tucked herself into bed, Lady Margaret knocked softly on her door. "Did you have a good walk, darling?" Sophie nodded, keeping her secret. She didn't want to share Bracken with anyone. Not yet. It felt like her only piece of magic in this strange new world. Days passed and the routine continued. Each evening, Sophie brought carrots, sat quietly, and read to the gathering ponies. Each evening, Bracken came closer. She watched the way his ears swiveled to catch every sound, the way he kept one eye on his herd, the other on her. Sometimes she thought she saw a question in his gaze. "Why do you keep coming back?" She wished she knew the answer. One particularly bright afternoon, as the sky burned orange with the promise of spring, Sophie risked stretching out her hand, palm open, a single carrot resting on her skin. Bracken hesitated, nostrils flaring. The air felt charged, as if the whole hillside was holding its breath. Inch by inch, he approached, breath warm against her fingers, and for the first time, she felt the brush of whiskers as he snatched the carrot and retreated. Sophie's heart soared. She bit her lip, grinning, feeling lighter than she had in months. She knew it wasn't much, just a small trust, but it was more than she dared hope for. From the path behind her, a voice called out, startling both girl and stallion. "You've got a knack for it," Dr. Collins said, emerging from behind a clump of gorse, hands in his pockets. "You're patient. That's what these ponies need. Patience and respect." Sophie flushed, embarrassed to be caught, but Collins only smiled. "You keep at it, Sophie. Sometimes the best way to teach a horse is just to listen." That night, as the lights of Ashford Hall flickered against the darkness and Bracken grazed peacefully on the ridge, something new took root between girl and stallion, a fragile trust, a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could both find what they were looking for. The night air inside Ashford Hall was colder than the wind outside. Lord Edward Ashford moved through the echoing halls with slow, measured steps, the tick of his cane the only sound disturbing the silence. The portraits of his ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes following him with a mixture of pride and accusation. Each one, soldiers, riders, landowners, had carried the weight of the Ashford name, had left their mark in these rooms and on the land beyond. Edward paused beneath the largest portrait, a dashing cavalry officer with a saber at his hip and a fierce glint in his eye. He studied the brushstrokes, searching for something familiar, something that might justify the ache of disappointment growing inside him. Was he the last of his line to matter? Was he the man who would lose the orchard, the wild hills, and the legacy his family had built for centuries? Edward's reflection shimmered faintly in the glass, silver hair and tired eyes superimposed on his ancestor's bold figure. He thought of Bracken, of the stallion's defiant spirit, and felt a pang of envy. For all his titles, Edward had never known the freedom that horse possessed. Everything in his world was weighed, measured, and controlled, his failures laid bare for all of Exmoor to see. Losing the wager to Victor would mean more than just the loss of land. It would mean the end of everything he had fought to preserve. Downstairs, the kitchen was filled with the comforting scent of fresh bread and simmering soup. Lady Margaret Turner sat at the table, knitting by lamplight, her needles clicking softly. She glanced up as Edward entered, her expression a careful blend of respect and old familiarity. "You're up late, my lord," she said quietly. Edward gave a weary smile. "Couldn't sleep. Too much on my mind, I suppose." She nodded, her eyes kind. "You're not the only one. Change is coming to Exmoor, whether we want it or not." He didn't answer, just poured himself a cup of tea and stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. In the far distance, the faint shapes of horses moved on the hills, ghostly and silent. Across the village, in the snug, crowded warmth of the Copper Stag, Victor Harrington held court. He stood near the hearth, glass in hand, spinning his vision for the future of Myrecombe. His voice carried, rich with promises, new jobs, prosperity, tourists filling the inns and shops, the sleepy village finally joining the modern world. Maps of his planned resort were spread across the bar, glossy images of luxury cabins nestled among orchards that for generations had belonged to the Ashfords. He handed out flyers with practiced ease, winking at the farmers and tradesmen. Think about it, folks. More money in your pockets, more opportunities for your kids. This place is stuck in the past. We need to look forward. A few of the younger men nodded, imagining paychecks bigger than any season's harvest. But in the corners, the elders murmured doubts, exchanging wary glances over their pints. Old Mrs. Dawes, the baker, shook her head. That orchard's fed us longer than Victor's been alive. Victor only smiled wider. Let's not be sentimental. Progress waits for no one. Why should we? Back at Ashford Hall, Edward found himself unable to settle. He wandered through the library, running his fingers over the spines of ancient books, volumes on horsemanship, land stewardship, and family histories now gathering dust. In a drawer, he found a yellowed letter from his father, written decades ago. Remember, Edward, we are only stewards. This land isn't truly ours. We borrow it from the generations yet to come. He closed the drawer, pulse racing. Stewardship, not ownership. Was that all that was left of his legacy? He wondered if he'd failed to protect it. Outside, the moon was full and bright, washing the landscape in ghostly silver. Sophie lay awake in the cottage, staring at the ceiling, listening to the restless wind. She could sense the tension gripping the estate, the grown-ups' voices strained, the villagers uncertain. Even Bracken seemed unsettled, keeping his herd closer, watching the horizon with sharp, anxious eyes. Sophie crept out of bed and knelt at the window, peering into the night. The orchard glimmered beyond the fields, trees ancient and gnarled, their twisted branches stark against the sky. She tried to imagine the land filled with strangers, the quiet broken by bulldozers and construction. The thought made her chest hurt. She didn't understand all the arguments about money and progress, but she knew what it felt like to lose the things you loved. The next morning, as fog drifted low over Myrecombe, Victor's men pinned up flyers in the village square. The posters promised jobs, entertainment, and modern life. "Vote for change," they read, splashed in bold colors. Some villagers tore them down. Others tucked them into their pockets, faces set and unreadable. At the stables, Ananya Patel gathered the grooms for their morning meeting, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She'd heard the rumors, seen the shifting loyalties. She knew how quickly an estate could change hands. She'd lived it before. Her voice was calm but firm as she assigned chores, reminding the staff that the horses, at least, needed things to stay the same. After breakfast, Edward found himself drawn to the orchard, walking the rows in the soft spring sunlight. He traced the bark of an old apple tree, feeling the roughness under his fingers, the quiet strength that had weathered so many storms. He remembered climbing these trees as a boy, his mother's laughter drifting through the blossoms. For a moment, the weight on his chest eased. A voice broke the stillness. Margaret, appearing at his side. "You're not alone in this, Edward. The land is stubborn, yes, but so are we." He looked at her, gratitude flickering in his tired eyes. That afternoon, as the sun slipped behind gathering clouds, Sophie spotted Bracken near the far fence, separated from his herd, mane tangled and eyes wary. She whispered a promise into the wind. She would not let this place be lost, not if she could help it. Even as the shadows lengthened and Harrington's ambitions pressed closer, something new began to stir in the heart of Ashford Hall, a quiet resolve, born from old pain and new hope, waiting for its moment to fight back. Rain hammered the rooftops of Myrecombe as twilight descended, turning the village lanes into streams and the hills into dark, brooding silhouettes. A storm had swept in from the Atlantic, fierce and sudden, rattling window panes and sending gusts that howled through the old yews surrounding Ashford Hall. Sophie pressed her face against the cold glass of the cottage window, watching the world dissolve into gray sheets of rain. Flashes of lightning lit up the orchard, each strike revealing twisted branches dancing wildly in the wind. Lady Margaret urged Sophie to stay inside, but the worry in the old woman's eyes betrayed her. "No sense risking a cold for the sake of a walk tonight," she said, pulling the curtains shut with a sigh. But Sophie could feel something stirring outside, a tension in the storm, an unease that gnawed at her even as she tried to distract herself with her mother's book. The pages seemed to blur, the words slipping away as the wind moaned louder. At the hall, Lord Ashford paced the main corridor, candle in hand, his nerves frayed by the relentless weather and the weight of his recent failures. He heard the distant thunder and tried to ignore it, but his mind returned again and again to Bracken, the wild stallion who'd become the unlikely heart of his troubles. Every instinct told him the horse would weather the storm, just as the ponies always had. Still, some voice within nagged him. What if something went wrong? Down at the stables, Ananya Patel moved among the horses, her practiced hands checking latches and doors. The younger grooms had long since run for shelter, but Ananya worked on, driven by a sense that something wasn't right. Between gusts, she thought she heard a distant, frantic whinny carried on the wind, but when she stepped outside, the world was nothing but chaos. Rain slashing sideways, trees bowing under the gale. Sophie lay awake in bed, unable to shake the worry building inside her. The storm was like the city sirens of her old life, danger that lived just outside the walls, waiting to pounce. She counted each boom of thunder, her thoughts turning again and again to Bracken and the other ponies. She pictured them huddled in the lee of the hills, eyes wild, nostrils flaring. She remembered the promise she'd whispered only the night before. "I won't let you be alone." Suddenly, a frantic pounding echoed from the cottage door. Sophie shot upright, heart thudding. "Sophie, quick, get up!" Ananya's voice cut through the noise, urgent and raw. Margaret hurried to the door, her face pale. Ananya burst in, soaked to the bone, breath ragged. "Bracken's missing. I found the herd scattered down by the west fence, but he's not with them. There's fresh mud on the lower trail. He may have gone down by the old stream. If he's hurt—" She stopped, her composure slipping. "I'm coming with you," Sophie said, barely waiting for an answer. She pulled on her boots and raincoat, adrenaline overriding any fear. Margaret tried to protest, but Ananya shook her head. "I could use the help, ma'am. If Bracken's down in the ravine, we'll need every hand." Together, they plunged into the storm, flashlights barely cutting through the downpour. The mud sucked at their boots, and tree branches lashed at their faces. Lightning strobed the sky, and thunder rattled their bones. Sophie's teeth chattered, but she pressed on, following Ananya's sure steps through the undergrowth. At the base of the hill, near the old stone bridge, they found deep hoofprints in the churned mud. Ananya knelt, scanning the ground by flashlight. "He came this way. See here? The grass is flattened." She stopped, listening. Above the roar of the storm, a faint, desperate whinny rose from somewhere down the ravine. "Bracken!" Sophie shouted into the darkness, voice trembling. They scrambled down the slippery bank, rain blinding them. Sophie's heart hammered as she caught sight of a dark shape tangled in the underbrush. Bracken lay on his side, legs trapped in a muddy ditch, his coat slicked with rain and streaked with blood from a shallow gash on his flank. His eyes rolled in terror, breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. "Easy, boy, easy," Ananya murmured, inching closer. Sophie knelt at the stallion's head, reaching out her hand, palm open as she'd done so many times before. Bracken's nostrils flared, but this time he didn't shy away. He was too exhausted, too scared. Ananya quickly assessed the injury. "The cut's not deep, but he's wedged tight. We'll need Ashford and a rope. Maybe Collins if we can reach him." Sophie stroked Bracken's forehead, whispering the old lullaby her mother used to sing. Lightning cracked overhead, but she kept her voice steady, her body blocking the worst of the rain from the stallion's face. "You're not alone. Not tonight." Ananya dashed back toward the hall, leaving Sophie in the storm with Bracken. Minutes passed like hours, every second punctuated by the stallion's trembling breath and the cold seep of rain through Sophie's clothes. She kept singing, her voice barely audible above the storm. But Bracken's frantic eyes gradually softened, his shudders easing. Soon, Lord Ashford appeared, lanterns swinging wildly, followed by Dr. Collins and 2 grooms. Working together, they looped a rope under Bracken's body and with careful coordination, pulled him free of the mud. Sophie held his head, speaking gently as they coaxed him onto his feet. Bracken staggered, but didn't collapse, his body leaning against Sophie's as if drawing strength from her presence. Dr. Collins knelt to examine the wound, nodding in relief. "He'll live. He's lucky. And so are we." The storm began to ease, thunder fading into the distance. Together, they led Bracken slowly back toward the stable, the light of Ashford Hall shining like a beacon through the dark, wet night. Sophie walked beside the stallion every step, her hand tangled in his mane, a silent promise kept. As they disappeared into the lamplight, the first hints of dawn colored the sky, a new day and a new bond, forged in the heart of the storm. The storm faded to a persistent drizzle by dawn, leaving behind a world scrubbed raw and shimmering with possibility. Inside the main stable, the air was thick with the scent of wet straw, liniment, and horse sweat. The grooms moved quietly through the corridors, tending to the herd and whispering the tale of Bracken's ordeal. But in the far stall, beneath the flickering light of a makeshift lamp, Sophie sat cross-legged beside the battered stallion, refusing to leave his side. Bracken's sides still heaved, and mud streaked his flanks, but his breathing had slowed, and the wild fear in his eyes was ebbing. Dr. Philip Collins knelt nearby, the veterinarian's hands sure and gentle as he cleaned the gash on Bracken's leg, working by the soft glow of his headlamp. He spoke softly, his voice a grounding presence in the hush. "He's lucky. A little deeper, and he might not be standing here. We'll keep him warm and calm for now. No sudden movements, and no loud noises." Sophie nodded, her hair still damp and tangled from the storm. She stroked Bracken's muzzle with slow, steady motions, humming under her breath. The lullaby floated through the stable, an old, bittersweet tune her mother used to sing on dark nights when the city felt too loud and hope too far away. Now the melody was a lifeline, not just for Bracken, but for Sophie herself. Lady Margaret had tried to coax her home for a change of clothes, a hot meal, but Sophie wouldn't go. "He needs me," she whispered, never breaking contact with Bracken's warm fur. Something deep in her had shifted, a responsibility blooming that was bigger than fear or exhaustion. Dr. Collins glanced at Lord Ashford, who stood in the shadows by the open stall door, hat in hand. Edward's face was drawn, eyes rimmed with sleeplessness and regret. He'd watched the rescue unfold, had seen Sophie's quiet courage and the way Bracken leaned into her touch. For the first time in many years, the pride that usually wrapped Edward's heart felt different. Not the brittle, defensive pride of the Ashford name, but something softer, unfamiliar. Collins finished stitching Bracken's wound and gave Sophie a reassuring smile. "He'll heal if we give him time." "You did good, Sophie." Sophie met his eyes, searching for any trace of doubt. "Will he trust us now?" Collins considered for a moment. "Trust isn't built in a day. It takes patience, and someone willing to stay beside him, even when he's scared. I think he's starting to understand that." Bracken's ears twitched, nostrils fluttering as he inhaled Sophie's scent. She resumed her humming, the notes trembling at first, then growing stronger. Her voice wasn't perfect, but it filled the stable with a warmth that seemed to push back the morning chill. Lord Ashford stepped forward, boots echoing on the flagstone floor. He paused, uncertain, watching Sophie with a new kind of respect. "You did a brave thing last night," he said, voice low. "Bracken owes you his life. We all do." Sophie didn't answer, but a tiny smile flickered across her lips. It was the first time he'd spoken to her like an equal, not just a child underfoot. Margaret entered, carrying a mug of steaming tea and a clean blanket. She tucked the blanket around Sophie's shoulders, brushing damp hair from her granddaughter's forehead. "Rest a little, love. We'll keep watch." But Sophie shook her head. "I'm not leaving him." She leaned closer to Bracken, feeling the stallion's heartbeat slow beneath her palm. The hours passed in a hush, broken only by the shuffle of hooves and the soft clinking of tack. Outside, the first rays of sunlight slipped through cracks in the roof, pooling golden light over the stall floor. The world outside seemed miles away. The village arguments, the threat of Victor Harrington's project, even the old sadness that sometimes gripped Sophie in the quiet moments. All of it was suspended, at least for now. Lord Ashford pulled up a stool and sat beside Sophie. He seemed awkward at first, not knowing what to do with his hands, but gradually he settled into the silence. The walls between them, built over years of loss and misunderstanding, began to crumble in the presence of a wounded horse and a stubborn little girl. Collins explained his approach as he worked, his voice soothing, patient. "With wild ponies, force only breeds fear. You can't bend their will, you have to earn their trust, step by step. The best horsemen know when to lead and when to listen." Edward nodded, absorbing the lesson in a way he never had before. He watched Sophie, so young and so determined, and wondered if this was what his ancestors had meant when they spoke of stewardship, not ownership. By mid-morning, Bracken dozed, his head resting against Sophie's knee. Collins cleaned his tools and stood, stretching tired limbs. "He'll need days of rest, no training, no fuss. Let him heal, and let him decide when he's ready." Sophie nodded, fingers tracing slow circles over Bracken's neck. Her voice, barely more than a whisper, drifted through the stall. "I'll be here every day. I promised." Edward placed a hand on her shoulder, gentle and uncertain. "And so will I," he said, surprising himself. "Maybe there are things I need to learn, too." The moment hung between them, fragile but real. For the first time, Edward saw not just his own failures, but the hope in a child's devotion and the lesson in a horse's battered trust. As the morning brightened, the world outside the stable slowly crept back to life. The grooms returned to their duties. Lady Margaret brewed a fresh pot of tea, and even the ponies in the nearby pastures called out in the warming light. But inside that stall, 3 unlikely companions kept vigil. An old lord confronting his legacy, a girl finding her courage, and a wild stallion beginning, at last, to believe in a gentle hand. And as Bracken drifted into a healing sleep, Sophie's lullaby lingered in the air, a promise that, whatever storms lay ahead, none of them would have to face them alone. Spring sunlight warmed the stones of Ashford Hall, dappling the paddocks and the far hill where the wild ponies grazed. It was a fragile peace. Bracken recovering, the mud scars of the storm fading, but the sense of something looming larger than weather or wounds remained. Sophie visited the stable each day before and after school, her devotion steady as the tides. With Bracken's injury healing, Dr. Collins had granted cautious permission to begin slow, careful exercises. Sophie was joined most days by Ananya Patel, the stable's head groom, who had quietly become an ally, bringing her own expertise and a patient confidence that settled everyone around her. On a bright Monday afternoon, Sophie found Ananya waiting at the paddock gate, a coil of long, soft rope slung over one shoulder and a bag of diced apples in her hand. "Ready for the next step?" Ananya asked, eyes twinkling. Sophie nodded, though nerves danced in her stomach. "Will he remember the accident?" "Horses remember everything," Ananya replied, passing her the apples. "That's why we show him trust, not force. Today, we'll practice liberty work. No bridle, no saddle. Just you, Bracken, and the rope for safety." Sophie stepped into the small paddock, heart pounding as she approached Bracken, who was already watching her. His ears flicked forward, then relaxed as she spoke softly and offered her palm. Bracken sniffed, lips gently seeking the apples, eyes never leaving Sophie's face. Ananya demonstrated how to attach the rope loosely to Bracken's halter, letting the stallion move freely but close. "We'll use our bodies and our voices. Watch, gentle cues, lots of praise. You want him to choose to be with you, not to run from you." They began with slow, looping circles. Sophie led with her steps, her tone light, sometimes humming that same lullaby. Bracken followed, wary at first, then more at ease as minutes passed. They practiced simple turns, stops, and starts, Sophie keeping her movements soft, always rewarding him with quiet words and another slice of apple. The paddock was their world, a place where fear faded, and trust was built one patient step at a time. Sometimes Ananya joined, showing how to move from groundwork to walking side by side, the stallion's head dropping in relaxation. When Bracken shied from a sudden noise, a bucket dropped by a distracted groom, Sophie stopped, waiting, letting him decide to return. He always did. Each session, a little more confidence grew in both of them. Sophie began to sense when Bracken was tense, when he was curious, and when he was simply happy to stand in the sun with her. They learned each other's rhythms, inventing a language without words. Yet, beyond the paddock fence, tension rippled across the estate. Victor Harrington was not a patient man. Word had spread that he'd visited the county council offices again, pushing hard for the signatures needed to claim the Ashford orchard. Each day, new flyers appeared in Myrecombe, promising jobs and prosperity, the bright paper littering the streets and tavern tables. In the great hall, Lord Ashford argued with advisers, his voice sharper than usual, the pressure mounting. "He's already met with the surveyors. He's measuring the orchard as if it's already his." Edward fumed one evening, hands clenched around a brandy glass. "If we fail at Cheltenham, it's all over. The Ashford name will mean nothing." Lady Margaret tried to reassure him, but the old fears were strong. The staff whispered of layoffs. The villagers weighed tradition against the future, and even the grooms seemed quieter, their eyes clouded with worry. For the first time, Sophie noticed the way people stared at her and Bracken, a mixture of hope and doubt. One grey afternoon, Harrington himself arrived at the estate, flanked by a pair of city-slick businessmen and a cameraman from a local news outlet. They sauntered up the drive, Harrington's smile wide and empty as he called out for Edward. "We're just here for a look around. Wouldn't want to miss the excitement of a dying tradition, eh, old friend?" Harrington's voice boomed, carrying across the courtyard. Lord Ashford met them at the door, jaw set, refusing to let Harrington step inside. "You'll see what you need at Cheltenham. Until then, this is private property." Harrington only laughed, waving his camera crew to get shots of the orchard from a distance. Might as well get some before footage. After all, people want to know where their future's being built. Edward watched them go, fists trembling with fury and helplessness. That evening, Sophie found him outside, staring into the dusk, his pride wounded but his resolve hardening. "I used to think that honor was something you inherited, like land," he said softly, not looking at her. "Now I see. It's something you earn. Every day." Sophie stood beside him, silent for a long moment, then reached for his hand. "Bracken trusts me because I stayed, even when he was scared. I think that's how you earn anything that matters." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and a new kind of respect shone in his tired eyes. The days raced on, the Cheltenham Horse Parade drawing ever closer. Each night Sophie practiced in her room, whispering commands and visualizing every move she and Bracken would make. Ananya encouraged her, teaching her breathing techniques and the subtle art of reading a horse's mood with just a glance. One evening, as dusk deepened, Sophie led Bracken out to the open pasture. This time, there was no rope, just trust. She raised her hand, signaled a walk, then a gentle trot. Bracken responded, calm and attentive, following her every cue. Sophie felt the eyes of the estate on them, the grooms watching from the fence, Lord Ashford from his study window, even Lady Margaret peering from the cottage. For a moment, the pressure faded, replaced by something almost like joy. When Bracken finally nuzzled her shoulder and stood quietly, Sophie realized she was no longer an outsider. She was part of this story now, a story of old wounds, new hope, and the kind of courage that grows when the world feels ready to break. But as the last light faded and the threat of Harrington's victory grew ever closer, everyone knew that the hardest test was yet to come. The morning of the Cheltenham Horse Parade dawned crisp and bright, a rare stretch of blue sky breaking through a week of nervous clouds. The air buzzed with anticipation as trucks and trailers lined the muddy fairground, banners snapping in the breeze. The world beyond Ashford Hall seemed to have shrunk to this one electric point in time, every heartbeat echoing with the knowledge that today, the wager would be decided. Lord Ashford paced the stables in his best suit, his face a map of anxiety and hope. Lady Margaret fussed over Sophie's hair, her hands gentle but trembling. Ananya checked and rechecked every strap, buckle, and latch, her steady presence soothing both horse and girl. Bracken, his coat brushed to a deep gleam, stood in the center of it all, alert, quiet, a living symbol of everything at stake. The Ashford group arrived early, avoiding the crowded rush of competitors and fans. They were met with curious stares and whispered bets from rival stables. The story of the wild Exmoor Stallion and the orphaned girl already making the rounds. Sophie tried to ignore the scrutiny, focusing instead on Bracken's breathing, the way his ears flicked as he took in the new sights and sounds. She spoke to him in a soft murmur, repeating the routines they'd practiced so many evenings under the quiet Exmoor sky. Still, her heart pounded. This was no longer just about saving an orchard or a family's honor. This was about proving, to everyone and to herself, that trust and patience could triumph over force and arrogance. Across the paddock, Victor Harrington held court among a group of investors and local officials. His voice boomed, his laughter sharp, as he pointed toward the Ashford camp. "There's the little miracle worker and her mangy pony. Take a good look, gentlemen. One way or another, we'll be celebrating in that orchard by sunset." Cameras hovered at the edge of the crowd, ready to catch the spectacle, the possibility of failure or glory immortalized for the evening news. Lord Ashford clenched his jaw as he watched Harrington, pride and fear warring in his chest. Dr. Collins placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "She's ready," he said quietly. "Whatever happens, you can be proud." Sophie found herself shivering, not from the chill, but from the enormity of what lay ahead. Ananya knelt beside her, adjusting the rope halter one last time. "Remember, don't think about the crowd. Just think about Bracken. He'll be looking to you for calm. You're a team." A bugle sounded, calling participants to the parade ground. The arena was a swirl of color, spectators in hats and finery, horses shining under the morning sun, ribbons fluttering from every post. Judges in red coats consulted their lists, and Victor Harrington flashed a predatory grin as he claimed a front-row seat among the local dignitaries. The announcer's voice rang out, crisp and formal. "Next in the Liberty class, representing Ashford Hall, Miss Sophie Turner and Bracken, Exmoor Stallion, Liberty demonstration, no tack or saddle." A hush swept over the grandstand. Sophie led Bracken into the arena, her hands steady, her eyes focused. The stallion followed, head high, a hush falling as even the skeptical onlookers recognized the power and grace in his stride. Sophie paused in the center, gave a tiny cue, and Bracken halted, standing tall at her side. The silence was so complete she could hear her own breath. She began with what she and Ananya had practiced, a walk in a wide circle, her body language gentle and inviting. Bracken responded, tracking her steps, his gait smooth and confident. A murmur rose from the crowd. So far, so good. Sophie raised her arm, signaling a trot, and Bracken quickened, mane flying, still tethered only by trust. The crowd leaned in, hundreds of eyes locked on the pair. Midway through the demonstration, a loud metallic crash startled the horses outside the arena, a vendor's cart overturning in the parking lot. Bracken froze, muscles bunching, eyes wide. Sophie felt the panic ripple through his body and for a split second feared it might all fall apart. She stopped, breathed deep, and started humming her mother's lullaby, the soft notes drifting across the sand. She let Bracken look at her, waited as he calmed, never forcing, just offering a presence in the storm. The crowd fell silent, sensing the moment, and slowly, the stallion's fear ebbed. He stepped forward, returning to her side, and the tension dissolved. For the final movement, Sophie led Bracken through the Spanish walk, the proud, high-stepping gait that she and Ananya had practiced late into the twilight hours. He performed it beautifully, each hoof placed with care, every muscle alive with concentration. Then, at the end, she slipped off the rope, letting it fall to the ground. Bracken stood, untethered, in the center of the ring. Sophie raised her hand. He lowered his head and stood absolutely still, the image of trust and partnership. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then the arena erupted in applause, cheers, and whistles raining down from every corner. Lord Ashford blinked back tears, pride swelling in his chest. Lady Margaret clutched her hands to her heart, and even the hard-bitten grooms allowed themselves to smile. Ananya wiped a tear away, grinning as she watched her student shine. Victor Harrington's face darkened as the judges conferred, but there was no mistaking what the crowd had seen. Dr. Collins leaned in toward Lord Ashford, his voice soft with wonder. That's what liberty really means. Not domination, connection. Sophie walked out of the ring with Bracken at her side, head held high, the cheers of the crowd following her every step. In that moment, she knew. Whatever happened with the wager, whatever plans Harrington might have, she and Bracken had already won something no one could ever take away. But as the sun climbed higher and the next competitors entered the ring, Sophie also understood. The fight for Ashford Hall and the future of Exmoor was far from over. As the last echoes of applause faded from the Cheltenham arena, a strange hush fell over the grounds. For Sophie, the outside world melted away as she slipped a hand along Bracken's strong neck, feeling the warmth and reassurance of the stallion's presence. They moved as one, out through the grandstand and back toward the trailers, hearts still pounding with adrenaline. Behind them, voices rose in excitement and disbelief. People who had never seen a horse perform with such freedom, who had never believed a shy, orphaned girl could command the respect of a wild Exmoor stallion. Lord Ashford was waiting just beyond the entrance gate, the knot of tension in his shoulders replaced by a joy he hadn't felt since he was a boy. He knelt and wrapped Sophie in a fierce embrace, his voice rough. "You did it, Sophie. You really did it." Lady Margaret dabbed her eyes, her smile tremulous but proud. Even the grooms, usually so reserved, crowded around, clapping Sophie on the back and slipping Bracken extra apples from their pockets. But the celebration was quickly interrupted by the presence of Victor Harrington, storming toward them, his face thunderous. The news cameras caught every step of his approach, the crowd parting around him as he barked orders into his phone and waved away well-wishers. This is ridiculous. Parlor tricks and circus stunts. That wasn't horsemanship. That was luck. The wager was for a real display, not this nonsense. Lord Ashford stood tall, voice clear and steady for all to hear. The wager was that Bracken would accept the halter and perform in the arena. He did more than that. He proved a partnership you couldn't buy with all your money, Victor. The judges saw it, the crowd saw it, and so did you. The judges, in their crimson coats, emerged to read the results, their decision final and public. For her demonstration of liberty, empathy, and the spirit of Exmoor, the award for Best Liberty Performance goes to Miss Sophie Turner and Bracken of Ashford Hall. The crowd erupted once more, the story already spreading beyond the parade ground. Social media posts, local news, even a call from a London radio station. Sophie blushed at the sudden attention, but never let go of Bracken's rope. Victor Harrington, still scowling, was forced to step forward and address the cameras. Of course, A wager's a wager, he muttered, voice clipped. I'll be honoring the terms. Ashford keeps the orchard, and I'll be funding their precious Exmoor Pony Reserve. Maybe it's time we let the past have its day. A ripple of laughter swept the crowd, but Harrington's humiliation was clear. He turned away, his plans for a luxury resort collapsing before the eyes of his investors. Some shook his hand politely, but most drifted away, eager to congratulate Sophie, Lord Ashford, and the rest of the team. Back at Ashford Hall that evening, the mood was jubilant. The great hall, so often silent and cold, now rang with laughter, voices, and the clatter of a celebration supper. The villagers of Myrecombe gathered in the kitchen, raising glasses to Sophie and Bracken. Lady Margaret baked extra apple tarts, and Ananya found herself surrounded by young stable hands, eager to learn her gentle methods. In the midst of the joy, Lord Ashford stood by the great fireplace, gazing at the flickering portraits of his ancestors. For the first time in years, he felt worthy of their gaze. He stepped forward and raised his glass. Tonight, we honor a new chapter for Ashford Hall, one built on trust, not fear, and on courage, not pride. We owe this moment to Sophie and Bracken, and to all who choose compassion over control. The crowd cheered, and Sophie, red-faced but beaming, squeezed Bracken's muzzle, whispering a thank you meant for his ears alone. Later, as the celebration faded into a warm, sleepy hush, Dr. Collins pulled Sophie aside. He sat her down near the old tack room, a mug of cocoa in her hands. You know, what you did out there today, it wasn't about winning a contest or saving a piece of land, he said, his tone gentle but firm. You showed everyone what real horsemanship means. Liberty training isn't about tricks or applause. It's about understanding, about meeting another creature where they are, and choosing to walk beside them. Sophie nodded, her eyes shining with pride and relief. It felt like, for once, I wasn't alone. Like we both belonged, Collins smiled. That's the lesson most folks never learn. Not really. You took your pain, and instead of letting it close you off, you opened your heart. That's what saved Bracken. And maybe in some way, it saved Ashford Hall too. Upstairs, Lord Ashford sat in his study, pen in hand, papers spread before him. The orchard deed was safe, but he had something else in mind. As the fire crackled, he signed the documents that would officially create the Ashford Wild Pony Reserve, opening the land to future generations, researchers, and anyone willing to learn from the ponies and the people who cared for them. By midnight, the last of the guests had gone, leaving only the quiet comfort of victory. Lady Margaret tucked Sophie into bed, humming the same lullaby Sophie had sung to Bracken. You're home now, darling, she whispered. Truly home. Down in the stables, Bracken dozed in fresh straw, ears flicking as the wind rattled the barn doors. Outside, the orchard glowed silver under a waxing moon. The story of the wild stallion and the orphaned girl had already become legend in Myrecombe, but for those who'd lived it, it was simply the truth. The greatest victories are won not with force, but with empathy and faith. And in the stillness of that night, the future of Ashford Hall was no longer something to fear, but something to look forward to. New beginnings born from hard lessons, second chances, and the undeniable bond between a girl and her horse. In the gentle hush of dawn, Exmoor lay wrapped in golden mist, the wild hills soft and endless under the rising sun. The world felt lighter in the days that followed the Cheltenham Parade, the old weight of dread gone from Ashford Hall and Myrecombe village alike. For the first time in months, there was laughter at the breakfast table, the grooms teasing each other as they headed out into the dew, the cook humming over loaves of warm bread, and Lady Margaret bustling about with renewed energy, always making sure Sophie had a second helping of porridge. Lord Ashford strolled the orchard every morning, boots damp with clover, fingers brushing the gnarled bark of the oldest apple trees. Where once he'd walked in fear of losing everything, now he carried the hope of a new legacy. It was not the legacy he'd imagined as a young man, a monument of pride and tradition, but something better, more honest. He greeted villagers as they passed, sometimes children from Meyercombe or old friends who, after years of cool distance, finally returned to share stories and plans. The Wild Pony Reserve was already attracting letters from researchers and students eager to learn about the rare Exmoor ponies, while local farmers were volunteering to help restore the hedgerows and rebuild broken stone walls. Sophie's days fell into a happy rhythm. Each morning before school, she visited Bracken, slipping into the pasture as the mist lifted off the hills. The stallion, proud and whole, would always come to her now, nickering low, his trust unwavering. They no longer needed the rope or halter. Sometimes Sophie would run through the orchard and Bracken would follow at a playful trot, the pair of them weaving through the apple trees as if the world were their own secret kingdom. One afternoon, as students from the village school gathered at the reserve's edge, Dr. Collins stood by with a smile, watching Sophie demonstrate gentle horsemanship to a group of awestruck kids. She showed them how to move with patience, how to let the horse choose to come near, and how the strongest bonds are forged not by force, but by kindness. Ananya, now officially in charge of all training at Ashford, recruited eager new assistants, young and old, from the estate and the village, turning the old rivalry into a new sense of community. Meanwhile, Lord Ashford finalized the paperwork that would protect the orchard and the wild pastures for generations. He stood before the assembled villagers and the county council, reading the new covenant aloud. From this day, the Ashford Wild Pony Reserve is open to all who seek to learn, to heal, and to help us protect the spirit of Exmoor. This is not the end of a legacy, but the beginning of one. Victor Harrington, outmaneuvered and exposed, disappeared quietly from Meyercombe, his plans for a luxury resort now the stuff of local jokes. In his absence, the village found a new pride in its heritage, local businesses already seeing visitors drawn by the story of Sophie and Bracken. The Copper Stag pub hung a painting of the famous Liberty demonstration above its fireplace, and on market day, townsfolk traded not just apples and bread, but tales of how they'd cheered for the little girl and the wild stallion. One crisp evening, as the last light faded, Sophie sat on the orchard fence, Bracken grazing nearby, and Lord Ashford joined her, his posture less rigid than ever before. They watched the ponies silhouetted on the hills, tails flicking as they moved with the ancient rhythm of their breed. "Do you miss London?" Edward asked, voice soft. Sophie shook her head. "I think I belong here now, with Bracken, with you, with everyone." He nodded, eyes shining. "I spent a lifetime thinking I was meant to control this land, but maybe it's the land that teaches us how to belong." They sat in companionable silence, letting the moment stretch. The lesson wasn't lost on either of them. The truest measure of strength is how you care for what's in your keeping, and how you lift others when they need it most. At the reserve's open day, hundreds came. Families, riders, students, and curious visitors from the city. Sophie, in her patched jacket and muddy boots, led Bracken through a gentle Liberty demonstration for a crowd that watched in absolute silence, then erupted in applause as she finished. Reporters snapped photos, But it was the quiet words afterward, the children wanting to pat Bracken, the elderly villagers thanking Lord Ashford for saving their home. That meant the most. Dr. Collins addressed the crowd, his voice echoing across the field. Let this story remind us all. Conservation is not just about saving a rare breed, but about saving something in ourselves. The courage to act with empathy, to care for what is wild and vulnerable, to leave our world better than we found it. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and rose, Sophie joined Lady Margaret and Ananya on the cottage porch, listening to the music and laughter drifting up from the hall. The lights of Ashford shone warm and welcoming, and somewhere on the wind, Sophie heard her mother's lullaby, a song of comfort that now belonged not just to her, but to everyone who'd found hope in this place. In the end, the story of Bracken and Sophie became more than legend. It became a call to action, a reminder that anyone, no matter how small or lost, can change the course of a place, a family, even a whole community, and that some victories are not just for the moment, but for all the days to come. If you believe in the spirit of Exmoor, in kindness and courage, share this story and join the mission to protect these wild ponies for generations ahead. Like, share, and support the Exmoor Pony Trust. And let's make sure stories like Sophie and Bracken's never fade away.